Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. The topic for this webinar is Solar plus Storage for Low and Moderate Income Communities. This webinar is a presentation of the Sustainable Solar Education Project. This project is run by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and it is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative. We have two excellent speakers with us today from the Clean Energy States Alliance. And before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we will save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience. So don't wait until the very end to type in your question. Type it in as you think of it, and that just improves your chances of getting your question answered at the end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You'll find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous CESA webinars on our website at cesa.org/webinars, and we will also send you a follow-up email within about 24 hours with a link to all of the webinar materials. And with that, I will pass it over to our host for this webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance. Nate?
Great, thank you, Samantha. And before I turn the presentation over to Todd, I just briefly want to tell you who the Clean Energy States Alliance is and what the Sustainable Solar Education Project that this is happening under is all about. So in case you're not familiar with us, the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA, we're a national nonprofit network of public agencies and organizations. We work together to advance clean energy. As you can see, we're made up of mostly state agencies, clean energy funders from across the country, so you can see our members on this slide. Okay, next. The Sustainable Solar Education Project. This webinar on Solar plus Storage for low and moderate income communities is being conducted as part of our Sustainable Solar Education Project. That's a CESA-run project to help state and municipal officials ensure that distributed solar power remains consumer-friendly and benefits low and moderate income households. Through the Sustainable Solar Education Project, we're developing a variety of educational resources for state and municipal officials on topics related to solar equitability and solar consumer protection. And this project is funded through the U.S. Department of Energy Sunshot Initiative. That's their Solar Training and Education for Professionals program. Next. So what are we producing under the Sustainable Solar Education Project? Well, a lot. We're doing a series of 6 guides, and I'll introduce you some of the guides we've produced and some that are in the works in just a moment. We're also doing webinars like this one. We're going to be developing some online course material as well as in-person trainings. In addition, you can keep tabs on what we're up to through our free monthly e-newsletter that highlights some news and information from across the country on solar equitability and consumer protection, and you can access that through the link at www.cesa.org and go to the Sustainable Solar Education Project. Okay, next. Great. So, as I mentioned, we're doing a series of Sustainable Solar Education Project guides in addition to the guide that Todd will discuss today on Solar plus Storage for low and moderate income communities. CESA has also published a bunch of other guides. We've published guides on solar information for consumers, designing publicly supported solar loan programs, and on standards and regulations for solar equipment installation, licensing, and certification. We've done that all under this project, and we've also got guides on programs and policies to bring the benefits of solar to low and moderate income customers, and a guide on consumer protection for community solar in the works. So those should be out in the next couple months, so stay tuned for that. Okay, next. Great. Okay, well, with that out of the way, let me introduce my colleague, Todd Olinsky-Paul, so he can talk to you about the topic you all tuned in for, Solar plus Storage for low and moderate income communities. Todd Olinsky-Paul is a project director for Clean Energy Group and CESA. He directs the Energy Storage and Technology Advancement Partnership, or STAP. That's a federal state funding and information sharing project that aims to accelerate the deployment of electrical energy storage technologies in the U.S. Todd also works on CEG's Resilient Power Project, which aims to accelerate deployment of behind-the-meter solar-plus-storage systems for energy cost savings and critical infrastructure energy resiliency. He's worked on solar-plus-storage operational and economic optimization with state and municipal energy agencies, Sandia National Laboratories, Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, and the National Renewable Energy Lab, and he's also authored numerous reports on state and federal agencies. Todd holds a BA from Brown University and an MS in Environmental Policy from the Bard Center for Environmental Policy at Bard College. Okay, over to you, Todd. The platform's yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Nate, and welcome everybody to the webinar. And I should say that in case my voice may sound familiar to some of you, it's because we do a lot of webinars and I'm often on the other side of the microphone. So I'm looking forward to experiencing what the presenters experience when I'm in Nate's chair. So this is a new report, and as Nate mentioned, it's one in a series. I'm going to go through a fairly straightforward agenda here. I'm going to start by doing a brief introduction to STAP and the Resilient Power Project, and the reason for that is that that's really where we got the background experience in working with solar and storage behind the meter and working with states and municipalities on policy around solar and storage that went into writing this report. So I want to give you that background. Then I will go sort of step through the report itself, you know, and with some emphasis obviously on specific areas, but I'll try to cover it fairly thoroughly without getting insufferably stuffy. And then we'll do questions. So let me start by just saying that one of the things that, as I mentioned, that we do is the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, and that's under a contract with Sandia National Laboratories. It's paid for by DOE Office of Electricity, and that's really focused on larger scale energy storage projects, so projects on the utility distribution or transmission grid, and that is something that does enter into the current topic in the sense that that we do have some projects, and we have seen some, and we've worked on some projects where you have for example, a municipal utility installing a solar and storage project on their substation, but it's providing benefits to a low or moderate income community. For example, they are providing resiliency benefits to the local shelter or to other critical facilities in the community. Or they may be providing cost savings as well to their ratepayers. So that, you know, that's sort of one category of projects that we cover in the guide, and this map just gives you an idea of where our various work has taken place in the STAP program, pretty much all over the country. Then I also want to do a brief introduction of the Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project, which is supported by a number of foundations that you see on the slide here. This really focuses on smaller behind-the-meter facility scale solar and storage, and that really makes up, you know, probably the majority of, not all, but probably the majority of the types of solar and storage projects that we would see in LMI communities. And again, this is focused on resiliency, but increasingly it's also, maybe primarily now, focused on cost savings as an aspect of resiliency, as well as backup power during grid outages. Both very important in LMI communities as well as everywhere else. This map also, similar to the previous map, shows you where the Resilient Power Project is active and supporting more than 50 projects around the country. So, to the guide. Again, I'm going to pretty much step through the guide. If you have it, you know, you can sort of follow along, but I'll start out with the sort of overall questions of what solar and storage really means, what I mean when I talk about it, and then why it's important for these communities in particular. So solar and storage is the marriage of two clean energy technologies, solar PV and battery storage. And the reason that it's important that they are installed together as a behind-the-meter system is that together they can provide benefits that neither can provide individually. And so here, this is just a sort of a diagram of what such a system looks like. You can see that there's, at the bottom of the diagram, there's energy storage represented by little batteries lined up there, and a solar array on the left. And in this case, these would be behind the meter of the facility. And in case of a grid outage, you would then be able to island that system, so physically disconnect it from the grid, and continue to provide power to the facility during the grid outage. And the benefits obviously are resiliency, but as important, cost savings and revenues, and I'll get more into explaining that in just a few minutes. So why solar storage for LMI communities? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that energy costs disproportionately burden these communities, and there's quite a lot of research on this. I have shown one report here from ACEEE and Energy Efficiency for All, and it's called Lifting the Higher Energy Burden in America's Largest Cities. But there are many reports you can find just with a simple Google, and basically these reports all show that low-income customers on average pay a much larger portion of their income for energy than do other communities. And furthermore, that they're not in a position to easily take advantage of energy efficiency and distributed generation technologies that could provide relief from these inordinate costs. Now, that's due to a number of factors. In some cases, it's because they don't own their own home. In some cases, because there's difficulty in getting financing. So there's a number of different aspects to this. What we see is that solar PV is increasingly being sort of targeted to these communities and included in programs like energy efficiency, which are supposed to provide relief, and that does help. Solar certainly does help. But adding batteries can often provide greater savings than solar alone, and in some cases a shorter payback period. So, the other reason behind this focus on LMI communities is that extreme weather and the resulting power outages disproportionately hurt these communities. They don't have the income, savings, insurance. Basically, it comes down to not having the kind of resources that it takes to, sort of weather the storm and then recover. So again, there's a lot of documentation on this. I've got an image here from a very good report called One Storm Shy of Despair. You can Google that and many other reports that document this. And just to show sort of the scope of the problem, obviously a lot of this work came out of Superstorm Sandy, which primarily impacted the Northeast, but as you can see on this map from 2016, these extreme weather related disasters are ubiquitous, and there's really no region of the country that's immune. And you see everything from fire to floods to storms to drought, and it's just the NOAA. This is a map from the federal NOAA folks, and they come out with a new map every year, and it's a completely different constellation of disasters every year. So we know, or we think we know, that this technology is very important and is particularly needed in low, moderate income communities, and the issue, of course, is how do you make it make sense economically, because even though we see a lot of state and municipal programs and incentives and so forth, grants and rebates, and we'll get into that as I go through the guide, and that's all really important. Eventually, these technologies have to make economic sense and be able to tap into markets so that they can support themselves and the industries can be not reliant on government incentives. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about business cases. And basically the business case for solar and storage depends on where it's located. And by where it's located, where on the map and where on the grid, whether it's behind the meter or in front of the meter. In this case, I'm going to focus on a behind the meter business case that relies really on demand charge management as the primary cost savings. And demand charge management is something that applies primarily to commercial industrial electricity customers. You don't see this on most residential bills, but it's very important for low and moderate income communities because you will see this often in a multifamily affordable housing facility where as far as the utility is concerned, at least the common areas of the facility are considered to be a commercial customer, so they're behind a commercial meter. And so what they see on their monthly electric bill is divided between energy costs and demand charges. So here's a sample bill, and you can see that just under half of the bill, about 49%, and this is from Southern California commercial electricity bill, about 49% is energy charges. That's what they're paying for electrons. And then 46% is demand charges. And the demand charges are essentially what you're paying the utility, who is in turn paying generators, often through an ISO or other RTO organization, to be there to supply peak demand. So when demand spikes or when a generation source drops off for some reason, you need to quickly ramp up generation, and so what they'll do is they'll bring on a gas peaker plant, for example, to do that. And so those peaker plants are paid to sit there in a state of readiness to make sure that the utilities and the grid operators can cover those spikes in demand. And so the way they pay for that is by essentially assessing all the commercial customers a charge, and that charge is based on the peak demand that that customer has during the month. So in this case, the demand charge is nearly half the total bill. And then you have a 5% fixed charge that can also be addressed by solar and storage behind the meter. I also want to mention that in some cases, reducing the demand charge has two positive impacts. It reduces the bill, but then it also can make the facility eligible to switch into a more favorable electricity tariff or electricity rate. And that's something that has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So the way that this works is illustrated on this little graph. The green line at the bottom shows you what's going on with the battery, and the red and blue at the top shows you what the load profile looks like. And you can see every time the load goes above looks like about 90 kilowatts in this case, or 85 kilowatts in this case, it turns from red to blue. And that corresponds with the battery discharging. So the battery has been set up to discharge every time the facility's demand starts to go over a certain set point. And the whole purpose of this is to keep the demand charge low. And so here's an example of the economic impact of this. So and this again is, I believe, from a Southern California commercial facility. So the sort of bullseye or pie chart on the left, you can see the original electric bill before installing solar and storage. You have over $10,000 in energy charges and $8,000 in demand charges and some fixed charges. When you add solar, and this is you're adding enough solar here to to have essentially a net zero facility. So over the course of the year, you're generating as much or more as you're using. So you're saving, you're wiping out your electricity costs, but you're only reducing demand charges a little. And the reason for that is that solar itself, without storage, isn't dispatchable. So you can't tell the solar panel to generate when the demand charge when the demand is spiking. It generates when the sun is shining and doesn't when it isn't, and there's nothing you can really do about that without storage. When you look at the chart on the right, this is where you've added storage as well as solar, and now you're addressing those demand charges. So solar alone, in this case, is saving the facility about $11,500 off of their electric bill. Adding a battery is saving another $10,300 per year. So you can see that the savings from adding the storage in this case is fairly comparable to the savings from adding solar. And the two work very well together. Here's another example also from California. And in this case you see three different scenarios. One is where you're adding traditional efficiency measures, the second is the addition of solar, and the third is the addition of storage. And you can see here that the solar provides half the savings, but the storage provides actually greater savings than the traditional efficiency measures. And we kind of think of these three as kind of a three-legged stool. You have efficiency, you have renewable generation, and you have storage, all behind the meter, working together to reduce costs. And again, this is for a 50-unit multifamily affordable housing facility in Southern California. Okay, so as I said, the impact of these is really locational, and it's going to vary from place to place. So here's a 3-city analysis. And you can see that it's very different depending on where you are. So in Chicago, just to quickly summarize this, adding solar to a facility resulted in a payback period of 20 plus years. Adding solar plus a 100 kilowatt battery reduced the payback period to 11.8 years, and increasing the battery size to 300 kilowatts reduced the payback period to just over 6 years. A very good outcome. On the other hand, look at Washington, D.C. There's really no difference in the payback period between adding solar alone or adding solar plus a battery. And in New York City, and I apologize that this is cut off at the bottom of the slide, but essentially it's the payback period is increased when you add the battery. It goes from, I think, just over 4 years to 14 years. So it really does depend on where you are. And this is the reason that people doing these projects now are taking quite a bit of time and effort to do comprehensive feasibility studies to make sure that they understand what the economic prospect of it is. So we know that in some places these types of systems can really pay for themselves. In other places they can't. And we also know that many of the markets that solar plus storage can provide services to are not currently available to them. In other words, they're providing benefit, or they can provide benefits, but you can't monetize those benefits right now due to various just various facts of the markets. So until those markets, and I'm talking here about ancillary services markets, for example, until they open up to solar and storage in a way that allows the technology to fully monetize the benefits it can provide, we're going to still see a need for state and municipal policy to support not only the deployment of these technologies, especially in areas where financing is difficult, such as low and moderate income communities, but also to support the development of the industry and the development of supporting industries such as the insurance industry, codes and safety regulations, financing, and all those things that really brought solar from a niche technology into the mainstream. And that's what's happening with solar and storage now. And while that transition is going on, there's some very useful policy tools that can be employed. And so I'm going to go through these. They range from your sort of typical standard state toolkit items such as grants and rebates and mandates and targets to some things that may be a little more out of the ordinary, such as alternative ownership structures. So I'll go through these. I'll try not to be incredibly boring, but it is a little wonky. But I'm going to try to highlight something of note in each section, just something that I think might be worth added attention. So I'm not going to read everything on every slide. So grants and rebates. Everyone pretty much understands grants and rebates. Typically, if you're just starting out with a new technology, you might want to use a grant program. This is a very good way to get demonstration projects built, for example. If you're more familiar and comfortable with the technology and you feel like it's sort of proven itself in a technological way, and now you're ready to sort of try to build the industry or help markets expand, rebates might be a good way to go. And these are tools that have been widely used by states and some municipalities to support all sorts of clean energy technologies. The one thing I wanted to point out is that, especially for grant programs, we feel that technical assistance is too seldom offered. And so what happens is that you get a fantastic grant program that helps to pay for the capital costs of the equipment, but often, especially in a case where you have low and moderate income community projects where the developer or the owner of the project may be a municipal agency, maybe a nonprofit, they're not professionals in the field of solar and energy storage, and they're not engineers necessarily. And so what they need to make these projects a success is technical assistance, both prior to applying for the grant, so some kind of feasibility study to help them put together a good application, but just as importantly, during the implementation phase. And so we've been working quite a bit with, for example, municipal grantees in Massachusetts under their resiliency initiative to provide some of this technical assistance after the grants were awarded, when basically the municipalities who got the grants were saying, well, this is great, we've got this money to pay for this equipment, but we don't really know enough to know whether we're getting good bids from vendors, to know whether we're getting a good proposal, and we need somebody to help us figure out, who should own it, where should it be located, and all that kind of detailed stuff that's going to make a huge difference as to the success of the project. So as an example, I'd suggest for this kind of thing, you take a look at the Massachusetts Community Clean Energy Resilience Initiative for grants and the California Self-Generation Incentive Program for rebates. Okay, utility mandates, procurement targets, and portfolio standards. I've sort of lumped these together. Obviously, they're not necessarily the same thing, but most state and municipal folks will be fairly familiar with utility mandates and procurement targets. Obviously, the big ones to look at right now in terms of mandates are the California Energy Storage mandate. Massachusetts is in the process of developing some procurement targets for utilities. One thing to note is that in some states, utilities may not be allowed to own generation, and storage often falls into that category as well, even though it's not really a generator. So if you're looking at some kind of procurement target and you want utilities to be able to own equipment, you need to have some kind of exception for that, as they're doing now with the New York REV. On the other hand, it would be very important to make sure that not all the systems are owned by utilities, because you want to develop markets and industry. So you probably want to make sure that at least some percentage of the procurement is done by procuring services from third-party owners of systems. So one important thing that I've sort of noted here is that mandates should be structured so that distributed resources receive a portion of investment dollars. So it's not all big systems sitting on the transmission grid, but that it's more distributed, closer to load in communities where it has a much better chance of directly providing benefits to those communities. And especially, obviously, low to moderate income communities. And so an example here is the California Energy Storage Procurement Target. I have a table here showing what they did. If you look at the totals, the column on the right, and then also how it's broken down, you can see that they break down the procurement between procurement on the transmission grid, procurement on the distribution grid, and procurement at customer sites. And so it's the customer sites that are going to be closest to load and most likely to directly benefit some of those communities. Okay, incorporating solar storage into existing programs. This is incredibly important, and we're seeing this right now intensely being worked on in Massachusetts, where there are a number of existing clean energy programs, including their solar initiative, their energy efficiency, 3-year plans, and their alternative energy portfolio standard. And the proposal is to integrate storage into all of these programs. Of course, they already have, they already support solar. So the proposal is to now integrate storage. And I'll give you an example of that is the Massachusetts Next Solar Incentive Proposal, known as the SMART, S-M-A-R-T, solar program. It's supposed to take effect in January of 2018. And so the proposed program will, in addition to the basic incentives for solar, will now have an adder for storage. So if you install solar and storage, you get an adder. There's also an adder for systems in low-income communities. There are also adders for things like rooftop solar, community-owned systems, so brownfield redevelopment. So you can, and these are stackable adders. So you can see how with one project you might be able to stack 2 or 3 of these adders if you hit those criteria, which I think is a very smart way to do it. And that's actually the details of that are available if you want to go to the Massachusetts SMART Solar Incentive Program. Just Google it, and there's a nice little presentation there on it. And I just wanted to point out that of all these types of existing programs, we think right now we're fairly excited about the idea of solar and storage being included in energy efficiency programs. There's a lot of money in energy efficiency, and even though generation and storage haven't traditionally been seen as efficiency measures, they really are. And it's crucial now to start understanding how all these things work together to provide efficiencies behind the meter. So, in addition to using less energy, you can now generate your own and purchase less, and then also attack your demand charges, do some arbitrage, charge up the batteries using the solar during midday, and then draw from the batteries in the evening when demand is high, so you avoid purchasing power. You can offset some of the negative impacts of things like reduced net metering rates, for example, which we're seeing in lots of states, attempts to reduce those net metering rates. Well, that's something that if you have storage in addition to solar, you can self-consume that power instead of selling it back to the utility. And when you do that, you're offsetting your retail rate instead of just getting a reduced maybe wholesale rate or whatever the utility wants to pay you for that energy. So these are all, we think, very, very important measures for efficiency programs. I also want to say something about tax incentives and alternative ownership structures. A lot of people hadn't realized over the past few years that the federal investment tax credit applies to storage as well as to solar. It's very important because it can be worth more than half the installed cost of the project over 5 years. The problem, of course, is that, well, there's a couple problems. One big problem, of course, is that a lot of the time you can't take advantage of it if you don't have a tax appetite. So a municipal agency, for example, a municipal utility, a nonprofit developing a project in a low and moderate income community isn't going to be able to directly take those tax benefits, but they can take it if they partner with a third party or a financial partner who has a tax appetite. So that's sort of the point of this. When you're designing a program, a grant program, or, any kind of program at the state or municipal level where you're trying to provide some incentive money for these kinds of projects to get built, very important to allow alternative ownership structures. And what I mean by that, third-party ownership with lease to own or a flip structure where after 5 years of being owned by the third party, the project ownership flips to the grantee or the incented party. These are important ways in which you can allow people to take advantage of those federal tax benefits, and that actually really benefits your program, because then your state or municipal program doesn't have to put as much money into each individual project, because the projects are able to not leave federal money on the table. And when you don't do this, and people do have to leave federal money on the table, for example, because they're required to own it themselves, even though they don't have a tax appetite, what happens is you're just basically telling people that they have to walk away from a fairly significant federal tax benefit. Okay, I wanted to also mention financing and clean energy financial institutions. This would include things like bond finance, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds of bond finance, green banks, energy resilience banks, credit enhancement, loan guarantee, etc. The thing I want to focus on here, and these are all potentially very good ways to provide support to these kinds of projects. Again, alternative ownership structures can be very important here. Third-party ownership with a power purchase agreement, a municipal improvement district, utility ownership, and the focus here is twofold. For one thing, it's what I just said about not being able to take certain kinds of tax benefits or credit enhancement, for example. If you don't have credit, credit enhancement is very important. But if you at some point, some LMI communities may need to partner with a more credit-worthy financial partner to take advantage of some of these sorts of things, or they may not own the property, and that's a really important issue. And so it's important to allow various kinds of alternative ownership structures. So you can have, for example, as I mentioned before, utility ownership, where even though the beneficiaries may be in the community, the utility may own, for example, the solar and storage itself, or a community-owned project would be another example, where you may not own the building that you're in, but you can own a share of like a community solar project, but this would be a community solar and storage project. I wanted to mention the New Jersey Energy Resilience Bank. It's the only one that exists, the only energy resilience bank in the country at the moment. You might want to take a look at that, but there's also a number of green banks, and they're starting to explore some of this kind of stuff. One note here, just to say that financing strategies are not a substitute for an integrated approach. The sort of danger here is that just financing alone isn't necessarily going to substitute for a range of other policy tools. So it's important, and this is kind of an overarching theme, to have a suite of policy tools, sort of like what's being developed right now in Massachusetts, and I mention them because they've done a lot of work over the past couple of years. A suite of policy tools, not just one, and that really broadens the impact. Okay. Market-based tools and regulatory reform. Basically, again, this is having to do with making sure that markets are supported in developing and allowing solar and storage to take advantage of those markets or to monetize those benefits that they can provide. It's very important, and it's unfortunately there's a limited amount that a state or municipality can do in some cases. These markets are regulated by FERC and by grid operators and so forth. But there are some things you can do. There's a good discussion of energy markets and what states can do to help storage, solar and storage, access those markets in the Massachusetts State of Charge report, which I recommend, and it's on the DOER website. Technical assistance tools and resources. I mentioned earlier, and so I won't dwell on this, that publicly funded technical assistance is very important to make sure that these projects are successful. LMI communities in particular might not be able to afford this kind of assistance, and so incorporating it into a grant or loan or rebate program is very important if you're going to reach these communities and make sure that these projects are a success. So, I'll run through a few conclusions and then we'll have time for some questions. I'm not going to belabor all of these, but I think that the basic conclusions here, solar and storage clearly offers a lot of benefits to society's most vulnerable communities, both in terms of resiliency and in terms of cost savings and reducing energy costs, and also guarding against the devaluation of solar, because as I mentioned, there's been a lot of talk and some action on reducing net energy metering rates, also about changing, time of use rates and assessing fees on solar customers, and these are all things that if you have solar alone, there's not that much you can do about it. With the addition of storage, you can start to address some of these things. And it does, in a sense, protect against the devaluation of solar. The markets, obviously, I've stated this a couple times, are underdeveloped for solar and storage, but state policies and programs can help support these systems and technologies, deployment of the technologies while the markets are maturing. And again, there's no silver bullet here. You need a policy suite that's broad, that includes grants or rebates, procurement standards, financing support, market support, soft cost reduction. There's all kinds of ways that you can approach this, and not simply focusing on one program or one type of incentive is the point here. Incorporating storage into existing programs that already support solar deployment is a very effective and in some cases much easier way to go about establishing support for solar and storage. And it's not too difficult to provide adders, multipliers, or other incentives to direct additional support toward projects in LMI communities. Energy efficiency programs in particular represent a significantly untapped resource. And I'm just going to read this last bit because I think it's very important. Solar+Storage enables numerous social goals, including emissions reductions, renewable generation, resiliency, energy efficiency, economic development, and improved public health. To date, it's rarely been incorporated into the numerous public policies addressing these issues, and its value hasn't really been fully understood by many NGOs working in these areas. So the incorporation of solar and storage into public policy and programs addressing these goals will help in providing access to low and moderate income communities. Before I close, I just want to make one more recommendation for further reading. This is a document published by CEG this year. It's called the Resilient Power Capital Scan. It really focuses on how foundations can use grants and investments to advance solar and storage in LMI communities. But the reason I'm suggesting it is that many of these strategies can also be adopted by states and municipalities. It is an extremely detailed report, and I can't go into it all the details. The report identifies 5 market barriers and more than 50 investment interventions to address those 5 primary barriers. And as I said, much of it could be adopted by states and municipalities with NGO partners. So it's a very important document, and I suggest that you take a look at it. You can get it from the CEG website. Okay, so I think that's it for my presentation, and I'll pass this back over to Nate.
Great, thanks much, Todd. That was terrific. So we've got a lot of questions, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can, but we may not be able to get to all of them. First question, so the demand charges that you mentioned, those only typically apply to commercially owned projects. Do you see demand charges happening in the residential market at all, and will that open up opportunities for Solar+Storage?
Yeah, actually that is the case. We are starting to see more utilities looking at and experimenting with demand charges on residential bills. But I do want to point out that it does affect residential, the residential market, especially in low-income communities, in the sense that you have these multifamily affordable housing facilities that often are on a commercial bill, or at least a part of the facility is on a commercial bill. Now the problem is comes in when you have a split incentive, and this is a commonly known problem, where the residents are paying their own electricity bills, but they don't own the facility. The building owner may be paying the bills for all the common areas, and those can be quite extensive, and we've seen instances where the common area utility bill is quite high because you're talking about laundry facilities, common spaces that have to be heated, elevators, water pumping, all kinds of things. But even though the building owner might have an incentive to do something to address those costs, they really don't have an incentive a direct incentive to address the costs that residents are paying. So, this is something that California has tried to address with their multifamily solar roof program. You should go take a look at that because it includes a requirement that essentially these are community solar projects on multifamily buildings, and the benefits must be shared between the building owner and the occupants. So that's a very interesting piece of legislation. But in general, yes, we see that the demand charge that has been common for commercial and industrial customers is starting to show up on some residential bills in some areas of the country, and yes, that certainly, unfortunately, provides an opportunity for solar and storage in those areas.
Thanks. A question about whether batteries are programmed to discharge at certain periods of time based on historic peak usage, or whether the system is able to detect an imminent demand spike and signal the batteries to discharge. How that works.
Sure. I don't know how you would detect something that's imminent if you are a behind-the-meter system. Now, for something like a utility, municipal utility, for example, will get all kinds of information from the ISO or RTO that they're in. So the grid operator is sending them a signal that says, we're expecting a peak today. For a facility scale behind the meter system, I think what you would do is just simply set it to discharge if demand crosses a threshold. So you're not really predicting it so much, although you could look at historical data probably and make some good guesses. But I don't know that you really need to do that. I think you simply set it up like a thermostat. So when the temperature crosses a threshold, the thermostat kicks on. Similarly, when the load crosses a threshold, the battery kicks on.
Great. Here's a question about what resources are available, whether there are resources available that compare local retail electricity rates against peak demand charges, and whether there are resources that, sort of to get a sense of where these projects may pencil out, where they may make sense. Are you aware of resources that do that?
Yeah, that's actually something we're working on. It's amazing. There's very little in the way of those kinds of resources, and I think it's because utilities tend to view this as proprietary information or private customer data, and so you don't, it's very difficult to get some of this kind of information. We have a project right now that we're doing with NREL that is addressing this. We are working on an online tool that kind of like some of the solar, calculators that have been out there for years, where you would put in your zip code and, basic information about your facility and your load and so forth, and the thing would give you some sense of, what size or what kind of solar and storage project might make sense for you. That we've thought for several years now would be a very useful kind of tool, and we're working on it.
Thanks. Here's a question about the interplay between Solar+Storage and efficiency. Questioner asks, please explain why you stated Solar+Storage is or supports energy efficiency. Is the statement more leading to the notion that Solar+Storage is their, funding sources, or can you just elaborate on that?
Sure. I guess it depends on how you define efficiency. This is something that I've run into recently. I was speaking to somebody on the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, and they basically said that traditionally they've thought of efficiency as something that decreases your net use of electricity. So, insulation or changing your lighting over to LED lighting or something like that, it decreases the amount of electricity you use, which is certainly very important. Now, when you add something like solar, you may not be decreasing the amount of electricity that you use, but you're certainly decreasing the amount of grid purchased electricity that you use. And that, is very important in a different way, because now what you're doing is that you are substituting a clean, renewable resource for a portfolio of generation that includes, in many places, things like coal and natural gas and nuclear. So, and then when you add storage and you start to reduce demand, you begin to affect the overall regional demand curve. So that what you see is that it's efficiency not necessarily in the traditional sense of efficiency, but it's a much larger, broader kind of efficiency, where now you're saying, well, we don't need to build another peaker plant because our demand peaks aren't continuing to grow as they have been, because people are now able to store excess cleanly generated electricity and then use it during high demand times. And so we not only have a cleaner system, we also have a less peaky system, and that means that we have a less expensive system. It also means we have a less polluting system, because some of the gas peakers are quite polluting. On a local facility level, you're saving, as a customer, you're saving money. You're using more clean and less polluting electricity, and we view it as a as efficiency in those ways. Now, is it going to mean that the customer doesn't use as much electricity in the course of a month as they did before? Not necessarily, but it's not the only measure of efficiency.
Great. Question about information available on how to ensure that there's a fair allocation of the financial benefit, particularly with respect to third-party owned systems and systems of this kind.
Sure. So if I understand the question correctly, so if there's a third-party owned system, how do you fairly allocate benefits?
Yeah, I guess the question is what resources are available to ensure that the low-income residents of some of these projects are actually receiving financial benefit.
Sure.
I think is where that's going.
Sure. So from the point of view of a state or municipal agency, you would obviously want to make that part of the policy. So if you're interested in equity, and we certainly are, various types of environmental justice and energy justice and so forth, you need to make sure that it's a requirement, for example, that benefits are shared, that the developer or the utility doesn't simply come in, set up a system, save a bunch of money for themselves, and kind of go away. It's certainly something that can be baked into the policy. Again, the California multifamily solar rooftop program is an example. On an individual project level, you need to include it in the contract. So if you are seeking to partner with a third party, for example, to take tax benefits, it would be like any other power purchase agreement, where you have to have an agreement ahead of time as to how those benefits and costs get allocated between the partners.
Great. We're getting close to the top of the hour, so maybe just one or two more questions. A question on how many of these affordable or low-income solar plus storage projects really exist, and in particular, sort of some follow-up questions about the numbers that you showed in the beginning of the presentation. Were those real or modeled? And then one more question, if you're willing to tackle it as part of that, is just why do they deviate so much regionally, geographically?
Sure. Well, as far as how many there are, I don't have a number, off the top of my head. There's a number of resources for that. I would suggest starting with our website, and CEG's Resilient Power Project website probably is the place to start for that. There are a lot. If you're referring to the maps that I showed, yes, many of those are in development and not complete and commissioned systems. Now, we're also not involved with many projects out there, so don't take those maps as being definitive. Those show where we're active and working with states and municipalities and developers on some of these projects. They don't necessarily, and I actually, Samantha, I would go to the Resilient Power Project map. They don't necessarily show everything that's going on. In fact, they certainly don't show everything that's going on. As far as the numbers being modeled, yes. So when we talk about savings on electricity bill, yeah, those are modeled numbers. Those are based on actual bills, and we're looking at the impact of adding various amounts of solar and storage capacity in this facility and how that would be used on a regular basis to offset portions of those bills. I think there was one other aspect of that question that I'm trying to remember.
I think the questioner also, there's a question also just sort of about why the numbers are so different, the model numbers are so different regionally, and I think you had it in your presentation, but maybe just...
Yeah, got it. Yeah, there are various factors. I mean, it ranges from the cost of electricity to the cost of labor in installing a system to what are the local incentives and tax benefits and you know, other types of supports that can be applied, to, you know, what are the demand charges. I mean, these things vary from you know, utility to utility, from state to state, so there's a lot of variation. And, you know, frankly, just which facility do you choose? You know, everyone's got a different load profile, so you know, and the markets are different. Can you provide frequency regulation from behind the meter? Can you be aggregated by, you know, an Internoc or a C-Power who's aggregating demand response resources, for example? In some places, yes. In some places, no. So, yeah, there's a lot of variety between, and unfortunately, the three-city analysis here doesn't, you know, it's very hard to parse out just from looking at these tables. I would, again, suggest going to the CESA and CEG websites and looking at some of the publications to get more details.
Great, thanks, Todd. Well, we've hit the hour mark, and we just got to a fraction of the questions, and I want to thank everyone for the good questions and the interest this has generated, and I apologize we couldn't get to more of them, but I do want to encourage folks to read the guide that Todd authored, and I again want to thank you, Todd, and then hand it over to Samantha for a closeout.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks, Todd. So there's some info on your screen where you can find some more information from the Sustainable Solar Education Project and from STAP and the Resilient Power Project. I also wanted to alert everyone to some upcoming webinars that we have. I'd encourage you to go to cesa.org/webinars for more information on all of these, and we have several others coming up that aren't listed as well, so please check those out. Thanks everybody for joining us for this webinar, and we will see you for the next one.